want to thank you for coming to Ansible Fest 2021, working with complex APIs when no modules exist. So who are we? My name is David Danielson. I'm an Ansible Automation Senior Consultant at Red Hat. I work with large customers, helping them accelerate their automation initiatives.
My name is Vinny Valdez. I'm a Senior Principal Automation Architect with Red Hat in our automation practice. And we work with very similar customers, and we help customers integrate with Ansible, and we're going to share our experiences with you guys here today. So this is what we're going to discuss. We're going to talk about a typical development scenario that you would encounter when trying to automate devices, some of the approaches you may take in doing that when no modules exist, some of the challenges that you may encounter, and some techniques that we've developed and ways that we've tried to interact with these devices. And lastly, we'll wrap up with some takeaways that'll hopefully help you in your content development. So let's start out with a development scenario. So let's imagine that you are happily automating. You're writing some wonderful Ansible automation code in YAML. Then you encounter some new device to interact with. So what's the first thing you start doing? Well, you want to look for ideally vendor-supported modules, ideally, because you want to be able to call a vendor if you have any issues, if you have maybe feature requests that you'd like to get into whatever this content collection would be. So you would ideally look in something like Galaxy, see if the vendors themselves have published any kind of collections or modules. Let's say you don't find anything, maybe you start looking on GitHub, or you start just searching the web for other resources by the vendor. Let's say you don't find anything. Maybe next I would go look at the vendor's website, start looking at resources for maybe they've written modules, but not necessarily published them anywhere other than their website. Maybe you need a support contract with them directly, or they may have an SDK, CLI tools that you can run, or other things like that. Failing any of that, then you want to start looking at their API documentation, because it is likely that with these devices you're trying to automate, you can at least hopefully talk to the API.
Yeah, so you can also find community resources available that other people have written that have uploaded to sources like Galaxy or Git. Many times they're written in a very limited scope that are fitting their needs and that aren't meant to work for others. So they're not always optimal in using.
And I forgot to mention, sometimes you'll find vendors that are somewhere in between. So a good example would be, I worked with a lot of Dell systems, Dell EMC, and they wrote their own modules. And as vendors, they decided to support them themselves. So you could go to support.dell.com, look up whatever model was you're trying to automate against, and they could give you modules that they would directly support. They also put these on GitHub so that you could stumble on them if you were looking around, but they weren't on Galaxy or really anywhere else. But if you follow their issues, one of their recently closed issues was people asking, hey, can you distribute these on Galaxy? And within some back and forth, they worked with the Ansible community, and sure enough, they published their open manage module and collection on Galaxy. And that was a good example of how vendors put out their, in this case, their automation for their own product and then support it themselves directly. But furthermore, they've also worked with Red Hat to certify that collection. So now you can also find that in Red Hat's Automation Hub.
Yeah, that's great. So you were not able to find any of those options, though. So now what?
So we're going to discuss now some approaches. Let's say we've got some device. We don't have any modules of any kind, supported or not. So what are some of the things you're going to start doing? Well, we talked about the vendors, and this is really going to come back on really trying to push your vendors to create those modules so that they can certify them ideally and support them. Sure, writing your own custom modules are great. I mean, Ansible is a fantastic tool set. It allows you to hide a lot of the complexity in the Python modules themselves, but what it really comes down to is the difficulty of supporting that yourself. If you're talking about large-scale enterprise automation, that's not something that you want to be the only person that can support, that you've developed and maintained yourself. And any kind of potential critical outage or any sort of issue where this automation is going to be something that has to really be supported by a team of engineers and other people, you really want something that is vendor supported. Other things that you could do for approaches on a device like this, we kind of talked about earlier. If the vendor does have some sort of some kind of tool that you can interact with the CLI, maybe look at command or shell if you can. Ideally, you may have to use a raw module. Those are some of the things I had to do with early Dell systems. They don't have a Python environment, but you could automate SSH directly into the DRAX until we came into Redfish and the modules that Dell are putting together. But many of the CLI tools that are out there can handle API communication very effectively. And there are even some tools that can output JSON. So if you, for example, OpenStack or some of the Hammer commands for Foreman or Satellite have an option to format the output in JSON. So you can read that directly and natively in Ansible. Just use the from JSON filter and then parse that however you need.
Yeah, so interacting with web services using REST API using the URI module. This can be considered the curl for Ansible. There's no external dependencies needed, no jump box needed. And if you want to look at it closer, you can check out the Ansible doc URI.
Okay, so with some of these challenges, or I'm sorry, with some of these approaches in mind, you're going to encounter some challenges. So we're going to talk about that and share with you some of the challenges that we've hit. So David, go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, so some issues with web services using their APIs. Often the vendor can have poorly implemented APIs that do not have great documentation, and they're pretty picky on syntaxing and can be difficult to work with. Like they may just error, but not really give you a good reason why. And it takes a lot of trial and error to figure out what you're doing wrong. So other challenges to overcome can be requiring additional logic and validation checking that is normally handled by the module. So often it will look like, you retrieve a list of objects, you check if your object exists already. If it doesn't, then it will create it. Then it will check if the object was created and validate that that change was made. So another thing to keep in mind is when creating roles to replace in replacement of modules is trying to build them in a modular aspect and in the same form that a module would look like. So its action would hopefully in the future be replaced by a single module instead of the current role you have. So here's an example of one that I wrote for deleting a VM. I have a login role, logout role, and then the deleting the VM role, and then I have a couple others in there.
So there are problems with this approach, though. This ends up leading to much less efficient code because as we just talked about, David mentioned, you're going to have to potentially write multiple tasks to accomplish what you normally would do in a single module call. And so even some of the modular approaches that David just mentioned, preparing for this talk, we even experienced issues where trying to call a role from inside another role is going to lead to namespace issues. And so it's not quite the same as calling a module. So you got to kind of keep a lot of these things in mind. And the other thing is Ansible itself is, by its design, supposed to hide that complexity in the modules, right? It's supposed to expose very simplistic task writing input for the actual users who are automating. So they're not really supposed to be doing 5, 6, 7 tasks just to accomplish one action, right? So the other thing that ends up happening is your output is much harder to read. And we'll look at some more specific examples a little bit later, but just imagine trying to read through multiple outputs of grabbing lists of objects and parsing through them and determining all the work that needs to happen just to create one simple object. So it ends up just being a lot more work. Okay, so now we're going to talk about, we mentioned some of the challenges. Let's talk about some of the techniques that we've developed to overcome some of these challenges. So, well, first thing I'd mention is when you're starting to develop and experience what it's like to interact with devices, maybe start outside of Ansible. Just interact directly with the device. You could use tools from the command line like curl, wget, or even Postman, and really try to understand how to interact with the API on a very basic level. You may even just use a web browser, log in directly against that API. Many times that'll provide some additional details, maybe some additional documentation that you didn't notice at first. The other thing is start simple. So if you're trying to do something very complex, like we said, you want to create an object, start with some gets, just read only, just see what the API returns, look what the data structures are like, just understand how that data is structured and what those will look like when you want to access them. It may make sense to even write those to files. Maybe you want to write some JSON directly, and once you get to writing in Ansible, and then maybe go to the UI or some other method, maybe a CLI tool, create an object, and then go back and do a simple get and see what the data looks like and do a diff. And just start to really understand what your changes look like once they're implemented. Then you can incrementally move up to maybe some puts or deletes or some other methods that you can try. Then you can start adding to the complexity of your URI calls once you understand some of the other options, like your body, header, authentication, all that sort of stuff. Lastly, if you have very complex data structures that you have to pass as the body, we'll really consider using like gender templating so that you can really define your structure in a template and then manipulate it that way via roles.
Yeah, and another issue is like command shell and raw will always report change status, and often API calls will just return as OK status if the submission was valid and is accepted, but it doesn't always return if the call succeeded or failed. It just said that it acknowledges that you created the call, which can be a challenge to then validating changes that you may have to start doing with a changed when as an additional task to keep track of if a change was made or not. So here's an example. This is the playbook for the delete VM. So as you see, I just have host all, I'm not gathering facts. And then there's a kind of cool module defaults here, which basically says for any Ansible built-in URI call, it's going to defaultly fill in the user password, force basic auth, return content, and validate certs fields on any URI module that I'm using later on. That way I don't have to keep putting this in for every single one. It's handy and it just saves some lines. And then I just have a task that's importing the role. And because it's a URI call, I'm delegating that to localhost. So the next one is, this is actually a login, which you'll see where I call that in a second. But this is basically just going in and doing a get and authenticating with that, and then registering the login, and then it will have a cookie that I can then reference later. So this next one, this is the one. So this is where you see where I'm calling a role login, and that's where what we just looked at. And then I'm pulling a list of VMs here, and that's how I have to call it. And then if you see on line 19, this is how I'm having to pull that cookie from there. Like we were saying, because it's a role, and because I made the login a role, it's a little bit more lengthy process to reference that cookie, but it's not that big of a deal. And then after that, I want to validate that there is either 1 or 0 VMs with the name that I'm running with. This way, I want to make sure that I'm not going to, since name are not unique and they have a UUID, I need to make sure that my search by the name is not going to come up with multiple UUIDs. And I also want to make sure that, to be more idempotent, that 0 is an option. And I'll show you how I handle if it's already been deleted a little bit later on. But that's what, so I'm starting here, and then you see that I'm just doing some JSON queries to get the length and first out of the JSON output that and searching for the host name. So the next thing I'm doing is setting the variable of that UUID here, and then I print it out, and then I have a little debug message where I'll let the user know, hey, this VM's already been deleted if it comes back blank. And then, but if it hasn't been deleted yet, then I do a block case to go through all these next steps to delete it. So I will then go in and call the delete command to delete that VM. And then I have to wait because it takes a few seconds to delete that VM. So I just put a timeout of 60 seconds to make sure that it had plenty of time to delete the VM. And then I go and get the list of VMs again, and I then check, and I am asserting to make sure that the length is now 0 to successful to say that yes, this successfully has been deleted. And then I have a changed when. So if the return value is not failed, then failed is false. If it is failed as false, then that means it is going to show as changed, and then that way it we keep track of that. And then theoretically we'd have a logout to release the cookie. This current API doesn't have that functionality, but I put it in here just to show that that's kind of normally what you would do.
Yeah, thanks, David. That was great. So if we think about all of those examples that he just went through, ideally could have been a single module task with simply a call to delete the VM and the name and state absent or something like that. Ideally, right? That's what we want to get to eventually, not have to do this amount of work. But here's another technique that we came up with. So data manipulation is very important. So if you think about when you are retrieving data and want to manipulate it, you typically want to operate on a subset of that data that you get back. You know, for example, in this some of the examples David just went through, we talked about retrieving a list of VMs and understanding something about it, you know, the length and other data that we need to operate on. So think about how you do that within Ansible, and you really need to also consider the cost of running tasks, every task that you have to run. So all those tasks that we just talked about, think about when you have to scale those out. If you have to repeat those many times, your data manipulation becomes very important, and it really becomes the place where your scalability can really start to impact your automation. So you really want to look at JSON query. If you're not familiar with JSON query, I hope that is one of the things you take away from this talk. So take a look. There's some really good JMES Path tutorials online. There's even there's extensions for VS Code, as well as a JMES Path terminal that you can run and run live queries and feed it or point it to a JSON file, and you'll see the output of your queries against that. One thing that I'd also want to share as a personal story, David and I worked on a few things together, and we've kind of collectively run into situations where early on, when you don't really come from a development background, and like myself, you do whatever it takes to bang your head on something until it works, you end up with some code that I'm about to share with you that is a little bit embarrassing to look back at now, but I'm hoping that sharing it with everybody will help you understand. But if you ever see set fact, loop, and when in the same task, you really should stop and think about why that is the case. So let's look at an example here. Right now, I'm going to pose this data set. So in this example, this came from a real use case where we're contacting a vSphere environment and retrieving a list of data stores. Now, part of the requirements here are what I have listed in the challenges. We want to find the data store with the largest free space. But we also want to make sure that the name of that data store does not contain any entries that appear in the excludes list. So the example I have here, just to make this simple here, is basically I don't want anything with bar in the name or do not use. And so you can see my data stores that I have listed below. Just looking at this as humans, we can see, well, I've got foo 1, 2, and 3, but I have bar 1 and 2. Bar is in the exclude list, so that should not show up. So out of foo 1, 2, and 3, I want the largest, so that should be foo 3. Should be the 300, in this case, probably gigabytes, that's what this stood for. All right, so with that data set in mind, this is going to fuel the next two examples. So this first example is something you should not do. So in this first task, what I'm doing here is I'm setting a custom fact, which is data stores invalid. Now, this can be improved with the same approach and probably fewer tasks, but this is kind of my first approach when I didn't really know what I was doing, right? So I'm basically creating a brand new list that only contains matches of this when statement, which is I want these regexes to basically build a list of all the names that match my do not or my exclude list, my list of terms that I do not want to show in the name. So now I have this list of invalid data stores. Once I have that, then I can loop through that again, and I can build a valid list, and I can do differences, and I can do all kinds of other stuff with the original data. Now that I have that, I could do some additional manipulation, like sorting it and find out, what of that remaining valid data store list, which of that is the most space. And then I debug that at the end. So don't do that. Here's a much more efficient way to do this. We will make sure everybody has a copy of this code, by the way. But what I'm doing is using JSON queries. Now, this does look kind of complex, but I've tried to break this down into task bars. So you can see all I'm trying to do is find out what the biggest data store is with valid names, right? So if we start here, the biggest data store is going to be, basically I'm going to look for this variable, data store names by free space, which is then defined down here. So you can kind of follow these variables and see what's happening, but essentially I'm doing the sorting here. In this next variable, I'm mapping out I'm extracting out a JSON query that matches down here below, which is basically I'm taking those exclude strings and I'm building a custom list of all of those, and I'm doing a reject filter with those regexes. So I want to basically say, only return things that don't match these regexes. And basically combining all those tasks into one. So this is something, if you're not familiar with JMES path or JSON query, definitely look into it. And this will help your task efficiency very, very, very much.
Yeah, so when building roles, try and develop it in a modular fashion, kind of like we've already talked about. That way, when hopefully if official modules ever do become available, you can swap out those roles whenever the modules come out in a nice, simple fashion to replace your custom code. And use collections to hold all of your roles in something like Automation Hub.
Something else, as a tip, when you work with API devices, you'll notice many times when you make these URI calls, you're typically going to delegate to localhost, or you should define your host as localhost at the top of your playbook. So that's a pattern that you see a lot. And the reason is because you're generating a call that goes to the API endpoint, but that is initiating from this local host. So if you're using something like Tower or AWX, that's going to happen on that actual device that is executing the automation. And so that is why you see that you have to either delegate it or target localhost. Something else to consider, though, depending on use cases, if you're doing maybe provisioning of different operating systems and maybe you have different inventory groups, David and I have run into this with other engagements as well, where you may want to write code that can handle either Windows or Linux, as an example, and you may have group variables that are specific to each of those. And however, the automation itself that role from a role. So you have to start being very explicit about the namespace of where you're referencing variables from. And so you have to really think about what groups items are coming from, and the way Tower puts group inventories together, which is slightly different because it does that at execution time. And if you have a variable defined in your inventory that refers to another variable and things like that, you can get into some issues that you have to explore. So something that I like to do, and it may not always work, but one thing you can do is define an API inventory host. So in this example, I have Acme API. That is going to be the endpoint that I'm going to automate against. So I define the host and just give the Ansible connection variable of local. So now in my plays, I can target, hosts can target Acme API. Or I could do a delegate to Acme API if I need to, but it could just be that whole playbook or whatever automation I'm targeting just happens to make sense because it runs all against this Acme API. So it eliminates the need to do delegate if you have everything targeting that API host. So just something to consider. Again, not always ideal, but it's something that may help you, especially if you're trying to keep track of what devices that you're managing. So when it comes to maybe Tower subscriptions, as an example, I've had customers that find it useful to look at their inventory and very explicitly see all of the endpoints that they manage. It may be a bunch of different API endpoints, not necessarily hosts.
Yeah, so here are some takeaways. The URI is the curl of Ansible. Custom modules are can be preferred, but they're extremely complex and to create and to support. And use your purchasing power to encourage vendors to create supportive modules.
Yeah, we really want to hope that that's the other thing that you take away from this message, from this talk, is the message of push your vendors to not just create modules, but also follow the official certification path for Red Hat Ansible Automation Platform. That way they can be in the platform and be available and certified and useful to enterprise customers. When you do design either URI playbooks or anything, just keep in mind that you would ideally like to replace those with the modules in the future. So some of the examples we showed you here, the vendor that we were actually using as our example did recently start to put out some modules, and they are looking into the certification process. So now that we know that, it really helps that we started to modularize a lot of the roles that we created. The other thing is, as I mentioned with data manipulation, don't use set, fact, loop, and when in the same task. And lastly, we talked about enforcing idempotency and making sure that you get the correct idempotent result that you're desiring, even if you have to use URI and you have to kind of do some extra tasks. And that concludes our session. We appreciate everybody's time.